Welcome to today's deep dive. So, the man who wrote the definitive book on rabid, obsessive fandom never actually worshipped anyone in his life.
Right.
Like, he actively avoided it. And I want you to think about that for a second. We are talking about a rock god who has spent decades staring out at oceans of screaming people, but who fundamentally lacked the psychological wiring to understand what it actually felt like to be one of them.
It is a brilliant paradox to anchor a deep dive with, honestly, because, when we think of celebrity worship, we usually think of a completely asymmetrical relationship.
Yeah, totally.
We project our hopes, our angst, our desires onto a flat, two-dimensional image of someone we don't even know. We need them to be larger than life because, that massive, unbridgeable distance between us and them is exactly what makes the worship possible.
Right. And today, we're looking at what happens when that distance collapses. We have an incredible stack of source material for this, excerpts from the book Fandemonium.
Which is fascinating on its own.
Oh, absolutely. Specifically, we're looking at a deeply introspective introduction written by Red Hot Chili Peppers frontman Anthony Kiedis, and that's paired with these incredibly raw, personal stories from the fans themselves.
Yeah, the contrast there is really something.
It really is. So whether you are a diehard music fan or just someone who's, curious about the bizarre social dynamics of celebrity culture, this deep dive is going to give you an unfiltered look from the other side of the stage. We're exploring what it means to worship an artist, how fame literally warps human interaction, and that profound, sometimes bizarre, symbiotic relationship between creators and their audience. So, okay, let's unpack this, starting with Kiedis himself, because his childhood completely immunized him to the illusion of fame.
Yeah, he grew up in a household that was just saturated with incredible music. He was exposed to Blondie, the Sex Pistols.
The Clash, right.
Exactly. His father, Blackie, was deeply embedded in the Los Angeles scene. But Kiedis describes himself during this formative time as an observer, not a rabid participant.
He was just kind of taking it in.
Right. I mean, he enjoyed the music. He would dance to it to get energized for a club. But he never felt that overwhelming compulsion to surrender his own ego to idolize the people making it.
And a huge part of that attachment comes from the fact that his dad actually had a grand master plan for him. Like, Blackie moved him to Los Angeles at age 11 with one explicit goal, which was to make him a movie star.
Wow.
Yeah. And Kiedis fully bought into this destiny. He even tried method acting for a massive audition to play the obsessed president of the Buddy Holly fan club. He listened to the tapes, studied the clothes, and totally immersed himself to try and manufacture what it meant to be a fanatic.
Which is incredibly ironic when you think about it.
Totally.
He was attempting to act out a psychological state of obsession that he had never, organically experienced. And the kicker is, he lost the part to a veteran child actor named Moosey Dryer.
Oh, man. Yeah, he was devastated by that.
Completely devastated.
Yeah.
He actually went on a severe drug and alcohol bender after losing that role. But looking back now, with decades of hindsight, he realizes that losing that specific part might have actually saved his life. If he had been sucked into the machine as a child movie star, he likely never would have become a musician at all.
It's sort of like he saw the wizard behind the curtain way too early, When you're 11 years old and your first friends in LA are Sonny and Cher just hanging out in your living room, you are instantly immune to the godlike illusion of celebrity.
Yeah, the mystique is just gone.
Exactly. He tells this amazing story about going to a Beverly Hills party with his dad. His dad is completely high, stumbling around, and Kiedis casually looks across the room and sees John Lennon and Paul McCartney just chatting.
Which is wild, considering the history there.
Right. These were supposedly bitter enemies at the time, and they're just casually standing there. And his high dad stumbles over and introduces him to John Lennon.
What's fascinating here is how that kind of proximity fundamentally alters your psychological baseline.
How so?
Well, when the people on the posters are just, sweaty guys at a party indulging your high dad, the pedestal vanishes completely. Plus, Kiedis had this grandiose sense of his own destiny. He intrinsically knew he was going to be an artist of some kind.
Right.
And when you have a very strong intrinsic sense of self, coupled with an active drive to create your own art, it naturally creates a psychological barrier. You're much less likely to completely surrender your own identity to emulate someone else. So instead of worshiping celebrities, Kiedis notes that he became a fan of nature, like marveling at trees and mountains, and a fan of underdogs and of pure kindness.
I mean, that is a beautiful sentiment, but it sets up a wildly contradictory dynamic when he eventually starts his own band. because Kiedis and his friends, who also weren't really starry-eyed fans of anyone, started their band with zero reverence for traditional rock norms.
It was basically an accident, right?
Pretty much. Before the Chili Peppers, Kiedis was originally in this jam band called Spigot Blister and the Chest Pumps.
That name is unbelievable.
Right. And his entire contribution was literally just screaming into a microphone.
They had absolutely no commercial ambition. I mean, their entire goal, the absolute peak of the mountain for them initially, was just to dominate the tiny 150-person capacity Hollywood club scene.
And the way they went about dominating that scene is wild. They would go to local bars, walk up to total strangers, usually women hand them a flyer, and confidently declare, if you want the greatest musical experience of your life, be here next Wednesday.
That takes some nerve.
It really does. And I have to push back on this a little bit, though. Isn't it insanely arrogant to promote yourself as the greatest band on earth when you literally only have one song to your name and you're complete nobodies?
It sounds like pure arrogance, yeah. But psychologically, it's actually the superpower of the unburdened artist.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
They didn't have the suffocating weight of trying to be the next Van Halen or whatever.
Yeah.
They were 20 years old, complete nobodies, and they had absolutely no shame because they had nothing to lose. That blind, localized, almost delusional confidence is precisely what allowed them to build a foundation.
I see.
They genuinely believed they had tapped into this unique motherlode of hardcore funk and punk energy. They weren't trying to please an existing fan base. They were daring people to join their weird club.
And early on, that audience was literally just their friends, their girlfriends, members of other bands. But then they attract their first true fan, and happens to be the eccentric German punk singer Nina Hagen.
Right.
Yeah, after just their fourth show, she pulls Kiedis aside and tells him, with total unwavering conviction, that they are going to be huge all over the world.
And beyond just validating their music, she actually teaches him a profound philosophical lesson about the mechanics of energy.
Yeah, this part of the source material was fascinating.
It really was. So, Kiedis was incredibly poor at the time, like practically scavenging to survive. He complimented a leather jacket hanging in her closet, and she didn't hesitate. She just gave it to him. She explained that the only way to keep good energy flowing is to constantly give things away.
That is such a counterintuitive concept for a broke kid, though.
Completely counterintuitive. When you're impoverished, your instinct is driven by a scarcity mindset. You hoard whatever you can get your hands on because you fear you'll never get more.
Yeah, exactly.
And Nina Hagen was teaching him the psychology of abundance. By freely giving things away, you signal to yourself and the world that there is always more to go around. It prevents the energy from stagnating. It was a radical internal shift for someone in survival mode.
And slowly, that kinetic energy did start to spread. He pinpoints the exact moment he realized their music had escaped their little Hollywood social circle. They were walking down the street in New Haven, Connecticut, far from home, and they heard these random black kids chanting the lyrics to their song Nevermind on the sidewalk.
That's a huge milestone.
Huge. That localized club confidence had officially mutated into global momentum. But as we see in the sources, that transition from a local secret to global mega fame fundamentally warped how people interacted with them.
Right. The dynamic shifted from a community of peers into something that was much darker and far more alienating.
Which is ironic, considering their early image was designed to prevent exactly that. Like, they were famous for performing naked, wearing only tube socks.
Yeah.
They would deliberately make themselves look ugly, smearing their bodies with mud and paint.
Yeah, it was a direct, visceral reaction against the highly polished, pretty boy posers of the 80s hair metal scene, like Poison and Warrant.
Exactly.
And that ugliness was actually a strategic weapon. By acting like absolute knuckleheads, they made themselves seem totally approachable. They weren't wearing fine suits, they were sweating and rolling in the dirt.
Huh?
But as their fame skyrocketed, that perceived intimacy backfired. The sheer scale of the fame mutated it.
It got deeply unsettling. Kiedis talks about how groupies who just wanted them specifically because they were famous became this massive turnoff for him.
Because it wasn't genuine.
Right. If the attraction was based on the power dynamic of fame rather than a real human spark, he wanted nothing to do with it. And then the physical manifestations of extreme fandom started appearing. He tells a story about a girl coming up to him with her boyfriend, dropping her pants, and showing Kiedis an Anthony tattoo right across her mound while her boyfriend just stood there.
Which is incredibly awkward.
Yeah, or fans approaching him with their entire backs covered in his lyrics. Or, most disturbing of all, an Italian fan who has stylistically and surgically turned himself into a perfect visual clone of Kiedis.
Seeing that clone is described as something straight out of the Twilight Zone, a total upsetting of the natural order. It represents the ultimate erasure of the fan's identity in order to completely consume the artists. And this deep alienation really comes to a head with what Kiedis refers to as the selfie scourge.
Yes, the selfie scourge. Think about the last time you ran into an old friend, or maybe even someone you deeply admire. What was your very first instinct? Did you look them in the eye and say hello, or did you immediately reach for your phone in your pocket to prove the moment happened?
Usually the phone these days.
Exactly. Kiedis reveals he has officially retired from taking pictures with fans because he actively laments how cell phones have completely destroyed genuine human interaction. People don't want to say hello. They don't want to share a joke. They just want photographic proof for their social media. He even mentions witnessing the actor Owen Wilson's face just completely drop when a warm, genuine conversation gets abruptly interrupted by a demand for a selfie.
Which makes perfect sense. If we connect this to the bigger picture of human psychology, we have to examine the nature of the exchange itself.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, a conversation, even a brief 30-second chat about the weather, is a relational exchange between two equals. A selfie, however, is a transaction that inherently reinforces a hierarchy. It essentially says, you are a rare, valuable object, and I need digital proof that I captured you. It dehumanizes the artist.
But is it actually fair for an artist to deny a fan a photo when that fan's money bought them their mansion? I mean, playing devil's advocate here.
It's a fair question, but fame inevitably brings severe boundary violations that go way beyond a simple photo. Fans think nothing of interrupting his bandmate Flea while he's trying to eat dinner, or terrifyingly stalkers harassing Kiedis' 90-year-old relative in a hospital bed in Michigan just to try and find a back door to reach him. The refusal to take pictures is his way of drawing a line in the sand for his own humanity.
And he shares a really telling anecdote about that, actually. He's at a farmer's market, and two girls from Moldova ask for a photo. He politely explains he's retired from pictures, but asks how they're doing, and they are furious.
They feel cheated out of the transaction.
Exactly. So he throws out this bizarre joke like, if you were Albanian, I'd do it. And one girl immediately snaps back, my mother is Albanian. And suddenly the transaction is broken and they're actually talking like human beings.
It's a desperate tactic to force the interaction back to a level of shared humanity.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because Kiedis was feeling so suffocated and alienated on a one-to-one level, it forced him to pull way back. He started viewing his fans from a macro perspective, observing how entire nations of people behave like a single massive organism during their live shows.
Right, the macro level is fascinating.
Imagine you have a tuning fork. You go out on stage and strike the exact same note every single night, but the cultural acoustics of the country you are in change the sound entirely.
That is a perfect analogy, because the socio-political climate of a nation deeply dictates how its people express their fandom. The crowd becomes a mirror for the country's psychological state.
Like in Japan, right?
Exactly. Take Japan in the late 80s. The band was warned that Japanese fans would treat a rock show like a polite ballet. They would sit down, wait for the song to completely finish, offer a polite gloved clap, and then wait in silence for the next one.
Though, within that polite culture, they did meet Kenji. He was this intensely aggressive teenage superfan who actually showered their drummer, Chad Smith, with incredibly expensive electronics.
Right, but he wasn't doing it just to be nice.
No, not at all. He was doing it specifically to assert his dominance in the fan hierarchy over the other kids. But generally, the crowds in Japan were very restrained at that time. Today, of course, Japanese festivals are just wild, beautiful mayhem.
And contrast that initial restraint with South America, a region that had been historically starved of live music. They had been largely ignored by major American rock tours for decades. So when bands finally did show up, the pent-up passion was explosive. Oh, the Brazil story. Yes. Kiedis tells an insane story about touring Brazil with Nirvana. They were literally trapped in their hotel by a mob of 5,000 fans. The pressure was so intense that Kiedis essentially had to flee into the favelas in Rio. He escaped in the middle of the night with an undercover cop and a transsexual hooker just to find the danger and anonymity he needed to feel like a normal human being for a few hours.
That is wild. And in Argentina, during a period of massive economic collapse and terrible flooding, the band played a free show. The fans waded through literal rivers in the streets just to get to the venue. When a system utterly fails its people and a band shows up anyway, it cements this lifelong, unbreakable loyalty.
And if economic collapse creates loyalty, what happens when the pressure isn't just economic, but physical and violent?
Right, the oppressed nations.
Exactly. The sources detail this stark contrast. Kiedis compares playing Northern Ireland in 1986, where, according to the text, the kids were surrounded by baby-faced British soldiers holding machine guns, to playing Red Square in Russia in '99. And in Russia, he observed the brutal Russian military literally beating fans with rifles just for dancing. And we're just reporting what's in the text here, but it highlights a profound psychological point.
Why does a kid risk a rifle butt to the head just to dance to a funk song?
Because for those oppressed youth, that concert wasn't just weekend entertainment. It was a vital, desperate psychological release valve. It was a 2-hour window of total bodily autonomy and rebellion in an otherwise controlled, suffocating state. The environment entirely shapes the energy of the crowd.
But, after decades of navigating these insane global extremes, from obsessive love to terrifying chaos, Kiedis eventually retreated. By the time their guitarist, Josh Klinghoffer, joined the band, Kiedis realized he had completely isolated himself. He was hiding in an air-conditioned cocoon backstage, totally disconnected from the 100,000 people standing out in the hot sun.
He had built up so many defensive walls just to survive the sheer volume of the fame that he couldn't feel the pulse of the community anymore.
It's like an astronaut. For years, he was just gritting his teeth, trying to survive the crushing G-force of the rocket launch. But then, his friend, a photographer named Dave Mushagain, wandered out into the massive crowd at the Sonic Festival in Osaka. Dave came back hours later and opened his laptop to show Kiedis the photos he took of the fans.
And that is the monumental turning point.
It was like the astronaut finally looking out the window and seeing the beautiful blue marble of Earth that he's been orbiting all this time. Kiedis saw families painted in matching band logos. He saw teenage girls having what looked like religious experiences. He saw a punk dad holding his baby, and he had this massive epiphany.
The year of the fan.
Yes, he declared this is the year of the fan. He realized he needed to take the camera off the band and put it entirely on the crowd. So he commissioned Dave to travel the world for 2 years, just documenting these people.
And through this project, Kiedis relearned the profound, real-world impact of his own art. He heard stories that completely dismantled his preconceived notions.
The stories in the source material are incredible. You have Julia from Spain, a minimum wage worker who loves the music so much she literally sleeps on park benches just to afford the travel to see their shows.
Incredible dedication.
And Nabil, a kid growing up in post-apartheid South Africa, he talks about how listening to the song Around the World helps him mentally transcend the deep racial segregation of his physical environment. Again, just reporting his lived experience from the source, but it's incredibly powerful.
And perhaps most powerfully, Kiedis hears from recovering addicts. They used his brutally honest memoir, Scar Tissue, as a literal recovery tool.
Yeah, that stood out to me too.
They didn't view him as an untouchable rock god. They saw him as a deeply flawed human who hit absolute rock bottom and somehow managed to right the ship. He became a tangible roadmap out of hell. He was proof that survival was possible.
So, what does this all mean? We've traced this incredible arc. We started with a detached kid who adamantly refused to be a fan of anyone. Then he becomes this arrogant underground club king. Then the immense fame hits, and he morphs into an isolated megastar, hiding from selfies and stalkers. But finally, through seeing these photos, he transforms into a man who actively serves and honors the people in the crowd.
This raises an important question, and it highlights a really beautiful irony in Kiedis' journey. At the very beginning, he stated that he believed being a fan meant giving up some of your own identity.
Right, surrendering yourself.
Exactly. But looking at the stories Dave Mushagain collected, the exact opposite happened. The music didn't erase these fans. It helped them build communities and overcome trauma. The fandom wasn't about losing themselves in Anthony Kiedis. It was about finding themselves through the art.
That is such a powerful realization to pull from this material.
And before we go, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Think about the bands, the authors, or the movies you love most. Are you a fan because of who they are? Or are you a fan because of who you become when you're immersed in their art?
Wow. It really is a completely different way to look at that poster on the wall. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, and we will catch you next time.